not sufficient to have your mobile phones on during this evidence session because they do interfere with Hansard, and the session is being recorded in audio, and so it does interfere. So I would ask members maybe to have their electronic devices on silent mode, as they do continue to interfere with the Assembly's recording. Members, I have received apologies from Mr Easton, Mr Hussey, Mr Flanagan and Mr McQuillan. There's no other apologies. Okay, members, moving on. Agenda item 3, which is minutes of our last meeting of the 22nd of April. If members are content, I'll sign them into the record. Agreed. And members, there is no new correspondence under any agenda today. Members, we'll now begin our evidence session for the inquiry into the effectiveness of public transport here, and I'd like to welcome Mr Peter May, who is the Accounting Officer for DRD, Mr John McGrath, who is the Deputy Secretary of Governance, Policy and Resources for DRD, Mr Tom Reid, who is the Director of Transport Policy, Strategy and Legislation for DRD, and Mr David Strahan, Chief Executive of TransLink, and Mrs Julie Sewell, who is the Head of the Public Audit and Accountability Branch for the Department of Finance and Personnel. And members, you will find the members' biographies for all of our witnesses here today at page 12 of your electronic packs. Okay, so you are all very welcome, and thank you for joining us today. And I am just going to open the session with some questions, if that's okay with yourselves. And my question is to yourself, Mr May. Obviously, public transport has played an essential role here in terms of the economy and the community-wide. An effective public transport system can help grow the local economy by bringing workers and jobs together around the region. It also improves the environment by promoting a more sustainable form of transport, which can reduce pollution and congestion and increase the mobility of older people and particularly rural dwellers and those with disabilities. So, Mr May, do you believe that the Department has been successful in improving and growing public transport system here during the period from 2002 till 2014?
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the question. I think the report fairly draws out that there have been a range of areas in which public transport has moved on positively in the period since the Regional Transportation Strategy was agreed in 2001. And I think that is down not least to concerted political effort from a range of political parties during that period to make sure that the focus remained on achieving the key targets in the Regional Transportation Strategy. If one looks at passenger journeys, which is a good metric in terms of the use of public transport and the success of public transport, we've seen substantial growth from 2002 up until 2013-14 of nearly 11%. Bus passenger numbers grew by 1.5%, whereas in comparison for GB, those numbers outside London had fallen by around 6% over the same period. And rail passenger numbers have really increased very substantially. They've more than doubled in the period. So I think that those are all good grounds for believing that public transport has gone the right way in the period. I think we at this end of the table are very conscious that there's not as if we can all declare success and go home. There is definitely many further stages to go in terms of improving public transport. We're very much committed to trying to take those steps. We welcome the recommendations in the report, all of which we are accepting and will be taking forward in the period ahead. We think that they do help us in terms of setting the direction of travel for the future, and doubtless members will want to touch on some of those issues.
Okay, thank you. Just in terms of the report, I mean, it is clear from the report that the performance of public transport here over the past decade has been a bit mixed. Passenger numbers have increased significantly on trains. However, the performance has not been repeated on our buses. Is there a particular problem with the buses, or is there any rationale for that?
Well, I think I highlighted that there has been a modest increase in bus passenger journeys over the period. I think if we went back to the period in 2001 when the Regional Transportation Strategy was set, there have been very marked declines in both bus and rail usage in the 5 years prior to the Transportation Strategy being set. And the two key focuses of the Regional Transportation Strategy were to redress the weaknesses in infrastructure in our roads and our weaknesses in infrastructure in terms of public transport. And over the period, there has been sustained investment in our public transport, both bus and rail, in order to try to ensure that there is to reverse the trend that had seen quite a sharp decline in that 5-year period. Now, as you look at the statistics and the graphs in the report, you'll see there is a dip in the middle of our period, around 2007 to 2010, in terms of both bus and rail usage. That is replicated across these islands and is largely a recognition of the recession that was being gone through at that time, and that is one of the key reasons. But since then, there's been a growth again in terms of passenger journeys. So I take your point that there's still a lot more to do, and I certainly don't remove from that. But I think that there's still, even on the bus side, there's some modest grounds for encouragement. Yeah,
but also just on that, there is a modest increase, but also there's a population increase as well, and it's how that is addressed. Would you agree that there's been no real model shift from cars to public transport within this period at all, or?
Well, modal shift is an important issue, and we are looking at setting a modal shift target going forward. There wasn't a modal shift target in the Regional Transportation Strategy, but the Belfast Metropolitan Transportation Plan did have a target in terms of numbers of people crossing the Belfast City Centre cordon, and the target was to reduce those numbers from 60% to 54% by 2015. At the moment, we're sitting at 48%, so we've more than achieved that level of shift. I think the idea of a modal shift is one that is complicated because we need to think about precisely what we're trying to measure here. I think it is important that we don't seek to set road users, car users, against public transport users. There are a number of different aspects that are relevant to a modal shift target, one of which would be around the wider active travel agenda around cycling and walking, which the Minister is very keen and is promoting actively, and we're doing a lot of work on. The second is that areas like car sharing, I think, ought to count towards a modal shift target as well as just public transport, because it's not simply about it's about the number of vehicles that are being used rather than the mode of transport that is critical. So on modal shift, there's only been a modest change. It's been within Belfast. That's the key area for any modal shift target. I think it's much harder to see how a modal shift target would work outside Belfast. And I think there are questions about whether a target really is only appropriate during peak hours, which is the point of congestion for the city centre largely. But those are areas that we will be looking at in the context of setting a future target for 2016 and beyond.
Yeah, okay. And just following on from that, in the report, the funding of public transport, the split between roads funding and public transport, and you touched a bit on it. What's the department's commitment to public transport? Because I see it's 35% hasn't been achieved. It's only 23%, is it? Has been achieved in relation to that. So what's the commitment to this?
Well, I think the average split over the last 5 years is 73% to roads, 26% to public transport. The proposition in the Regional Transportation Strategy, and which has driven the work of the department, was that we needed to do two things. The first was to invest in our roads infrastructure, and the second was to invest in our public transport infrastructure. The two are connected to some extent in that buses clearly use the road infrastructure in any case. And there's been a very significant rise in the level of investment in public transport over the period of the Regional Transportation Strategy. It's essentially 85% increase over the base levels in the period before the Regional Transportation Strategy started. now, and the increase in roads has been around 84% over the base for there. So there was not a target to try to change that split. And so for that reason, perhaps it's unsurprising that the split has not particularly changed. The one area where investment did not happen in public transport, which is drawn out in the report where it was anticipated, was in relation to Belfast Rapid Transit. And there remains a programme to deliver Belfast Rapid Transit in the years ahead, and that will be, it'll be important that the department finds the funding in order to ensure that that can proceed, and that remains a priority for the department as we go forward.
Would you concede that this has had an adverse impact on public transport?
Then not having Belfast Rapid Transit?
Yeah.
Well, ideally, we would have Belfast Rapid Transit in place. I agree with that. That would be a means of growing public transport still further. Our projections are, in the business case, that over time we will see a significant rise in passenger journeys as a result of Belfast Rapid Transit. It will take some time to change behaviours, but we are putting the infrastructure in place. You've seen Belfast on the Move, and there are further work on bus lanes across the key corridors that will be used for Belfast Rapid Transit. That is ongoing at the moment. Unfortunately, that's causing some disruption as things stand, but in due course there will be a benefit, and I think that will be important.
Yeah. And just another question, that the department had planned to adopt a 3-tier system to govern public transport, with the department setting policy. The new independent agency planning for regulating and funding TransLink and TransLink delivering services. However, this didn't happen. The new agency was not created. Instead, the department set up a small division within Transport NI. Why was there a backtrack on that, Mr. May?
Okay, you're right that there was a proposition about 3 different layers. The middle layer, the agency, was always seen as being within the Department for Regional Development, in other words, reporting to the Minister for Regional Development. John may want to say some more about that in a moment. But the key reason why it didn't happen is that at the time when the decision was being taken, there was a wider look at how government was being structured, and there was actually a strong move away from the creation of new non-departmental public bodies and away from the use of next steps agencies towards having things more directly under the bailiwick of ministers, more directly accountable to this Assembly as a result. And I think that was the key contributory factor as to the change in approach that was taken at that time. I don't know if you want to add to that, John.
Just simply also, I mean, the resource context means that the sort of model that might have been envisaged in previous times is no longer affordable. I think the key issue is, has there been any detrimental effect of the fact of that model not being put in place when you still have a system where you have ministerial policy set, delivery mechanisms responding to that? So policy increasingly changes. I'm not sure I would describe it as backtracking. It evolves to take account of the political, as Peter, context as Peter said, and the resource context, and that will continue to happen in the future.
Okay. Just let me go back to my first question about passenger numbers increasing significantly on trains but not being repeated on buses. Mr. May, do you believe the fares, the fares on our buses, have an impact on this? Because I was just picking, saying to members earlier that I was picking this up on some of the doors when we were out during a canvass. Yes. And I know I'm just talking very parochial here in my own area, where there are issues with mainly students that are travelling up and down to Belfast, where some students that would come home during the week, the fares, some of the concessionary fares, and I was made aware of one individual who to use his concessionary fare on a 2-day, 48-hour pass thing, he would have to travel from Strabane, he would have to travel to Derry to avail of a specific concessionary fare to Belfast. The same bus is actually passing Strabane, but he's not able to avail of that concessionary fare in Strabane, and it's the one where you can travel, and you would have to travel back within 48 hours. So I don't know if you're aware of the disparities or the discrepancies in those types of fares. And I mean, you know, it's if we're looking to get more passengers on our buses, you know, that's an issue in my area, you know, and if it applies one place, it should apply all over.
Well, I certainly wasn't aware of that specific incident, but thank you very much for raising it with me. And David may want to say some more about it, and it may be useful to have a few more details. I think more generically, we do accept that public transport to some extent is sensitive to price change. And the report actually fairly draws out that the pricing of public transport here is pretty much on a par with what one would expect. It's not seen as being particularly high. So there is that, but there are other factors that influence the use of public transport. The comfort, the speed, the accessibility and the frequency of service versus the ease of use of other means of transport as well. So it's a multifaceted picture of which price is one aspect. We are very conscious of that element. And David, I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, I don't have a lot to add, but I would note that in the railway side of our organisation, we have seen a significant growth in passenger numbers, as has been identified. And that is, in my view, not been driven primarily by the fares. It's been driven by the offering that we offer our passengers and that service. We now have the new trains, the significant investment that we have seen in the new trains provides a completely new customer experience. We've got free Wi-Fi and so on. So I absolutely take your point that fares is one issue, and there's efforts that we are taking to ensure our fares are maintained as low as possible in terms of driving out overhead costs out of our organisation. But I think the overall passenger offering is something that passengers consider whenever they're making the choice as to whether or not they're going to choose public transport, and punctuality and reliability are key.
Mm-hmm. Just on that, and I know Mr. Clark wants in here, but if we're looking to put more people on our buses, surely we have to look at the flexibility around the policies and fares overall, because if one individual has to travel to Derry to get a specific fare to allow him to go to Belfast, but can't get that in his own hometown, I think that's a bit...
No, I agree. That seems an odd issue, but
yeah, I accept the point. It doesn't sound right. So I'd be happy to pick up with you after the meeting.
No bother.
And investigate that specific issue.
Thank you, Trevor.
Yeah, just to bring Peter back, and you made reference to the fares and the fare increase, and you were talking about comparable with others. I'm sure the chair was probably indicating at the most recent rise. I'm not entirely convinced that everyone else in the other sectors had an equally as large increase. So maybe were you referring to the most recent rise, Peter, or are we just talking in general terms? Well,
I've been talking in general terms about price sensitivity. There was an increase in February of this year, as you're well aware from our discussions at the committee, but that had been after a period when there hadn't been a rise for some significant time. I think what one's seen elsewhere is that rises had happened on an incremental basis, and we hadn't had that. We'd had one bigger rise at the end of a period rather than a lot of stepped rises during the period.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. Members, moving on, we'll go into our lines of question. Deputy Chairperson.
Well, the area I was covering has already been pretty well covered, so I'll maybe, if you don't mind, deviate a little bit. We're talking about policy and strategies and so on. I understand, Mr. Reid, you're responsible for that. But I'm trying to get my head around who makes the ultimate decisions. And I address the question maybe to Mr. Strachan. You have a board, is that right?
Yes.
And you got a new chairman this week?
Yes, there's a new chair has been announced. He takes up position from the 1st of July this year.
Right. He's a busy man. He's already involved in more ways than one with Big Lotto, Strategic Investment Board, and I don't know what else. Do these people find the time to actually sit down and discuss these critical issues that we're talking about today? Or do they? Or, you know, who's making the policy? Is it the department? Is it yourself as Chief Executive and your team of officials? Or what what part do these directors who are drawn from NITHCO, what part do they play in this?
So, in respect of setting transport policy, that's a matter for the Minister and the Department. In terms of the running of TransLink and ensuring we deliver an effective public transport system, that's my responsibility, to which I'm held accountable to my board. So our board meets...
Held accountable to your board for what?
For all the range of services and everything that TransLink actually does on the ground.
So is this board nothing more than just a wee consumer committee? Or do they actually, with their large salaries for their 2 or 3 days a month, do they actually contribute anything to policy, the type of thing that I accept Tom does well?
Setting policy direction is a matter for the department. It's up to TransLink then to deliver effective public transport on the ground, and that's what I'm, as an executive director of TransLink and the chief executive, responsible for. The chairman is responsible for running the board and making sure I'm held to account, and I'm making sure that I deliver an effective organisation.
It's also, I think, fair to say that when the Minister is looking at policy issues, he will consult TransLink and take the views of the board seriously in terms of reaching his conclusions. He may well then, as a result of setting that policy, set objectives for TransLink, which the board would then be responsible for ensuring are delivered against.
Put the question to you another way. Do you think your organisation is badly in need of a board of directors that are there to actually transform and change the way public transport operates and to articulate the needs of the people?
Well, I can speak for the period of time I've been in TransLink.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Mr. Shanahan. I'm more than impressed with the short time you're here. We're just talking.
But to give an account of the direction that I've been setting, we have launched and we accept the recommendation in the report and the points that's noted in the report here in respect of our management overhead and the fact that the ratio of operational staff to management is not comparable with other organisations. However, there are things that our organisation does that other organisations don't. However, I've put in place a programme of driving efficiency in our organisation, and our board is absolutely behind that move and is very supportive of what we're seeking to do. We're seeking to take out £3.1 million in terms of the management overhead of our organisation in order to make it more effective and more efficient. So I've had support and nothing but support from my board in respect of driving that change agenda, and that's something I'm determined to continue to deliver.
The remarkable increase in rail passengers, I presume, was taken because this Assembly made available massive millions and millions of pounds of money to relay the tracks and buy the new trains. There was a lot of money also made available to the buses, but certainly in relation to Ulster Bus, and one, observes that the buses that are driving around the country are top notch. You couldn't get better, but the numbers are not here. Is that not something that your board of directors might be concerned about, or are they just... I'm still lost, Chairperson. I don't know what this board does.
It is something we've been seeking to address. The decline of, I think it's around 12% in respect of Ulster Bus, as you rightly identify, as something that is of concern. We have been working on a bus strategy at our organisation, and that's designed to deliver growth in passenger numbers from 67 million up to 80 million by 2025. And our objective is to deliver our total passenger numbers from 80 million to 100 million by 2025, and that's roughly 80 million bus passenger journeys and 20 million rail passenger journeys. So we are seized with the fact that, yes, the growth in bus patronage has been lower than railways, albeit taking bus journeys overall. Bus passenger journeys overall have increased in comparison to GB, where they have declined over the same period. But we're not complacent, and the bus strategy is designed to specifically focus on Ulster Bus and Drive, and to turn the decline in that and drive passenger numbers up.
Do you think, in relation to Ulster Bus, that services large rural communities is likely to achieve that, given that there's just been a massive reduction in the amount of money given to the community transport operators, who, I presume, if we had some kind of integrated transport system, would actually be linking into your service? Is this another obstacle now in your way in trying to achieve your targets?
I think what has happened in Ulster Bus over the years is that we've seen a network that has grown, if you like, in a fragmented way. And we've seen services added on here and there. What we're seeking to do in the bus strategy is to essentially start with a clean piece of paper again and say, where is the highest demand in terms of moving rural passengers, and making sure that we design our services around where we're going to drive passenger growth and where passengers actually want services to be. So I acknowledge in the current situation, in respect of the current funding challenges, it's not easy, but actually that drives us to look very hard at the services we provide and make sure we're providing them in the most effective places that drives passenger numbers and where passengers actually want them.
The issue which you've just mentioned, Mr. Strachan, is one that certainly, if I had anything to do with TransLink, would concern me a great deal, because it seems to me that, and I'm moving on to this, the concessionary fares, those concessionary cards are worthless if there's no integrated form of transport to make them work.
I accept, yes, someone who's a holder of a concessionary pass needs a service in order to use. The issue that I face running TransLink is that we're seeing an almost 20% reduction in our funding this year in 15-16, which is around £13 million. I've put in place a plan designed to meet that gap. The first thing I've identified is delivering £3.1 million out of the management overhead of our organisation. The fare increase that we've seen recently, while absolutely unwelcome, and no one wants to see higher fares. However, in my view, it's better to have a slightly higher fare and have a service than not have a service and a lower fare. And then the third element is actually redesigning our bus services in order to meet that shortfall in funding. But you're right, there's a wider public debate here in terms of the extent of bus services and public transport services that are provided in Northern Ireland and the funding for such.
Yep. Chairperson, the concessionary fare thing is something, of course, I think we all support it. But is that, in a sense, providing cover for a far worse crisis, given that, you know, a large number of people, and I want to ask you in particular about those between 60 and 65 who may still be at work. Have you any idea how many people like that, for example, are now using the concessionary fares?
I'm not, but certainly anecdotally I'm well aware of people who are between 60 and 65 and who are still in work, and in fact people who are over 65, because of course now there is no, if you like, defined retirement age, and people can continue to work with the agreement of their employer beyond 65. So yes, without a shadow of a doubt, there will be users of the concessionary scheme who, if you like, have not retired or are still in work. However, you know, the criteria around the concessionary scheme, you know, is not really a TransLink issue. That's a matter for the minister and our politicians.
Well, it's a TransLink scheme, and I suspect that the introduction of the concessionary fare scheme has enabled you to attract fare-paying passengers, and that you've been able to moderate your fares because you get, is it how many £1 million extra?
Well, I mean, I think the concessionary fares this year is in the order of 41 million that the department is providing.
41 million, just for the record.
But there's a very strong cross-party consensus behind the use of concessionary fares.
I'm not speaking against concessionary
and extending
fares.
it.
I'm asking you to recognise that it's an important factor which is clouding the decline that would have taken place had the concessionary fares not been introduced?
I think of the 18 million passenger journeys, 13 million were down to concessionary fares.
Yes.
Fare-paying passengers rose overall by 8.8%. Those on metro rose by 30% and on rail by 60%. Clearly, there has been a decline in fare-paying passengers on Ulster Bus over the period.
So really, I suppose what we want to hear today is what are you doing about that?
In terms of driving fare-paying passenger numbers?
Yeah.
So, in terms of the issues that were discussed at the start of the top of the meeting in respect of the offering we're providing to our passengers, we're seeking to roll out the wider use of Wi-Fi. I think that's been one of the key things that have driven and is very popular on the railways. We're seeking to expand that on the bus side of the business. It's in Goldliner. We're seeking to expand that further. I think, again, the issues we touched at the start of the meeting in terms of punctuality and reliability, passengers really depend on their public transport system to be punctual and to be reliable, and we're putting a lot of effort into making sure that our services are punctual and reliable, and also the comfort of our buses. But the bus strategy that we're seeking to roll out over the coming period will seek to refocus our resources on the most popular routes and ensure we drive the frequency up in terms of those services that are most used by our passengers. So that's how we seek to increase the number of particular bus passengers in the future.
The announcement that the subsidy is going to be further savaged, does that cause you to have yet another rethink on what you're for doing?
The funding cuts that we're facing this year are in total 13 million, and the plan, if you like, the financial viability strategy that I've put in place is designed to bridge that gap. It will take us 2 to 3 years in order to become profitable again, or to become break-even as an organisation while we go through the change process. But the plan that we have in place will meet the funding challenges that we currently face.
In relation to Belfast, the quality bus corridors, and that was all outlined in the regional transport strategy. But the downturn in bus speeds is obviously something that puts people off. How do you address that?
Yes, I accept that. And one of the things that has actually worked against us has been the fact, in terms of bus speeds, is the fact that in Metro we've seen growth in passenger numbers of around 33%, a third, because buses are taking longer at each stop because there's a greater number of people. I think there's a couple of ways we can address that. One is in the quality bus corridors and making sure that bus lanes are in fact bus lanes, and that the illegal use of those is clamped down on. I know the department are taking measures forward in respect of enforcement of those bus lanes, but also, and I think this is probably going to be the most radical way, around 50% of our passengers actually pay by cash, and that delays people getting onto the bus. And what we're trying to do through our fare structures is encourage people onto non-cash methods of payment, which is actually cheaper. And our new ticketing, next generation ticketing, which we're planning to roll out, I think from 2018 onwards, because our ticketing system needs updated, will encourage greater use of non-cash methods of payment, which will allow us to get people onto buses much quicker. I think in respect of BRT, that also comes with a ticketing system which is non-cash and which will allow for very rapid entry onto the bus and exit off it, which will help our bus speeds.
Deputy Chairperson, there's a number of members looking in on
Sure.
supplementaries. Paul?
Just on that very issue about the fares and, you know, the access and the flexibility of the fare aspect, appreciate that, you know, having travelled quite extensively in other areas where you buy one ticket and that allows you to hop on to any form of public transport, and you don't care whether it's Metro, Ulster Bus, Northern Ireland Railway, whatever, you know, it's all part of the TransLink group. When is there a joined up ticket system going to be introduced, instead of trying to look at we isolated areas and protect, you know, well, that's ours and we don't want anybody to interfere with our wee area of our tickets for the trains, or we don't want anybody to interfere with. And having one ticket which will cover everything. And I think if there was such flexibility, it would be a greater encouragement for fare-paying passengers to use it, where they would have the opportunity to actually know that if you live in a rural area where you've access both to the railway and to the bus, you're not going to necessarily always get the bus, but you can get the train to take you in, and if the flexibility allows, then you can use another service as well on your ticket. And can that be facilitated?
Is that like the Oyster ticket in London?
Same idea, the very same thing, yes.
Do you go to London?
I know someone who works in London Transport. Go on ahead, Mr. Strachan.
I'm amazed at them.
Go on ahead,
Much
Mr.
use out of
Strachan.
London.
Sorry for the distraction.
I agree with the member's comments. I think just before I deal with that specific issue, just one observation, if I may be allowed. It's clear to me that within TransLink we essentially have two organisations. We have a railway organisation and a bus organisation. The management restructuring and the restructuring that I'm carrying out at the moment will create an integrated organisation where bus and rail are truly integrated and that they are not, and I wouldn't overplay this, that they have been competing with each other, but they haven't been managed as an integrated business.
One another if it's managed correctly.
They do. They absolutely do. And as I say, I wouldn't overstate the fact that they've been competing with each other, but what I want to see is a single management structure sitting above a bus and rail, completely integrated organisation, and that's what my management restructuring will achieve. That then flows on right down through the organisation to the very issue you've identified. You should be able to buy a credit or a ticket or a card which allows you access to bus and rail, and that's what the new integrated ticketing system will do. Our current systems can't deliver that, but that's what our new integrated ticketing system, which will be somewhere between the £30 and £40 million investment, will deliver, and that will allow greater ease of access, which is all again designed to help to deliver an increase in patronage. Because if we make it easier for people to use public transport, I think people will use it.
Okay, thank you. Members, there's a few members looking in on supplementaries, if you could keep them brief. We have Trevor, Dahi and then Roy. Trevor?
I suppose my supplementary was about 10 minutes ago, but the chair wouldn't let me in at that particular time. However, I have to say, I take encouragement, David. I've said this a number of times I've met you, and whilst what you're going to do is very important, I'm disappointed you're going, because you're coming with a vision that TransLink have lacked for years, and the management within TransLink have lacked for years, and you have set them on a particular path. I have to say, I'm actually fearful whoever your predecessor is, that'll come in with their own vision, which won't have that drive and enthusiasm. Sorry? Successor. Sorry. I was only walking then. So whoever that may be, I am concerned that you have turned that organisation around in a very short space of time. In relation to savings, you've identified those savings, and it's coming on to my main question later on. But I want to take you back where because I'm going to criticise you now at this point. After all of that, David, all those nice things.
Is it your brief intervention, isn't it? Yeah.
This is my briefing. Deputy Chair, whenever you're the Deputy Chair. In response to John, you talked and you justified the fare increase. My concern is, and I mean, if we look at the tables in relation to the report, the fare, the distances travelled per head of population, Northern Ireland is one of the worst. And it's okay to have reliability and comfort on a bus, but one of the other things that is important to people is value for money or affordability. And to continue to increase fares, you said to John that you're actually better having a higher fare and to continue to have a service. I mean, that's not how Tesco's and Asda work. They don't actually work on high value items, they work on volume. So I think what TransLink haven't got right is they haven't got the volume right. They're certainly doing the work in relation to the comfort. There's work to be done in terms of the reliability, in terms of fares, the timetables. But if you actually start to dabble with the fares, it's going to make it a service that people can't use, and people are going to get back. So instead of actually encouraging people to public transport, they're going to get back and look at their own mode of transport. So it's really a disagreement, and I'm trying to get you to come round to our way of thinking on this one here.
No, I accept your point. If I may touch on the first point of your comments, by the time I leave the organisation, the restructuring that I've put in place will be embedded, and I don't believe it will be possible to go back. So I think the integrated nature and what we're seeking to drive in TransLink will be embedded within the organisation. I do absolutely take the point that there is a tipping point where you reach where if you put fares up, you lose passenger numbers. That's something we look at every time we look at our fare increase. In order to assess if we put our fares up, will we lose more passengers than income we gain through a fare increase? We haven't seen a lot of evidence of people moving away from public transport as a result of the fare increase we had in February.
However, David, sorry, I'm going to interject there. Your fare increase was only half. You came with 2 proposals and you opted for half the proposal. So whilst you haven't measured much, I would suggest, given that that was the direction of travel, the higher increase could have had the effect that many of us were worried about.
I accept that. It's obviously an unknown, and the Minister has made a decision in that respect. And I think the other point to mention that we are very mindful of, because we are genuinely very mindful of it, is we need to remain competitive, not only in relation to other regions, but also in respect to car use. Yes, if my comment earlier was interpreted as blasé in terms of putting up fares, that certainly wasn't my intention. I think I was making the comment that in respect of the fare increase we had, in my view, it was better having the fare increase and trying to plug part of this £13 million gap with an element of increase in fare income, as opposed to trying to deliver it all through either service reductions or management restructuring costs. Because I do think, in terms of the management overhead we're taking out of the organisation, I believe it is ambitious. And I'm not aware of any other public body that's taking as much out of their management overhead and administration costs as we're seeking to deliver. So I do take your point, and certainly there's no complacency on my part or on TransLink's part in respect of just the answer to a funding reduction is a fare increase. That is not our approach, and that's what we've kind of demonstrated through the recent funding cut we've had. It's a multifaceted way to try and address what is a very, very, very challenging financial position for TransLink. TransLink will lose around 30 million between 2014-15 and 2015-16, and that, if it continues, is not sustainable. So the financial viability strategy has to be about more than one thing.
Okay, thank you. Dahi?
Thanks, Chair. I like what other members have said, and that public transport has improved over the years, and there's just a fear that we're about to go backwards instead of forwards and continue the progress we already have. I would use public transport on a regular basis, and there is a difference between the rail and the bus in terms of service. I mean, the rail, you get consistent Wi-Fi, and the buses are very, very patchy. You know, so if I'm making a choice coming into Ballymena Station, I'll go for the train every time. And you know, it's quite clear there's a big disparity there, and those that are trying to attract more passengers onto the buses are struggling because there is those gaps. But you know, the buses are advertised as having free Wi-Fi, and obviously there's money being paid to a provider to provide that. If it's not working, you know, what is the provider doing to address that? Are we getting value for money in terms of the bus package?
I accept your point, and as a member who lives in a rural community in North Antrim as well, I accept the point you're making, and yes, it is patchy. It is dependent on the signal, because it works through a SIM card, so it's dependent on picking up a signal. So in very rural parts, the signal struggles, as we know. And in fact, the area where I live, with some mobile providers, I don't have any signal, I have no service. I think, though, that the issue we've identified is that on bus, it's the Gold Line fleet that has Wi-Fi. What we're seeking to do is to roll that out to more of the bus fleet. But yes, you're right, we are seeking, and whenever we go out to tender on that service, we will be looking at the network coverage and the network provider we actually go with to make sure we maximise whatever network provider can give us the greatest coverage. But I think, yeah, there's a range of things, as you've identified, that drives people onto public transport.
Is that due to go out to tender again anytime soon?
I'm not. I can't answer the specific detail of when that's due to go out. But if you wish, I can confirm that with you.
The other problem, I suppose, is infrastructure. And whereas you're going to invest a lot of money in terms of the buses, if the stations aren't of the appropriate quality, people aren't going to want to wait about. If there's not enough car parking spaces, Ballymena being the example again in both these instances, then it's a deterrent to those who say, well, it's only half an hour to Belfast, anyway, I'll jump in the car. So is there a need for greater? There is a need for greater capital investment, but when can we see, in terms of the stations being brought up to the same standard as the service you get on the trains?
Well, we have seen. We've seen over the last, I think it's the last 2 years, an increase of around 1,500 park and ride parking spaces. That brings the total number up, I think, to almost 8,000 in terms of park and ride facilities. And I know Ballymena, which is the area I live in, the services I use, we've seen, I think, around 50 or 60 new car parking spaces added to the park and ride facility there. We are actively seeking, particularly on the railway there. As you know, the parking facility is full before 8 o'clock in the morning, and there is latent demand there, we believe. So we are seeking opportunities to expand that facility as land becomes available. However, as you know, the facilities in the centre of Ballymena and getting access to additional land at an affordable price can be challenging. I think in respect then of the railway facilities and also bus facilities, you're right, it's about the whole customer experience. We've seen investment in a number of stations over the last period of time, and we will see further investment in other facilities as capital budgets facilitate.
Where is the business case for a new station in Ballymena? Is the paper up there?
If you wish, I can either come and brief you on that after the meeting, or write to you in respect to taking that forward.
Okay, that's a couple of supplementaries. Roy?
My question is actually Ryan there that Becky's been at, but my question is to Peter May. In terms of, we've heard that there's been a decline in Ulster bus passengers, the rural passengers, and not been using Ulster bus to the same extent. But what I have seen, particularly in Millbrook Park and Ride, there used to be 10 to 20 cars parked at the side of the road. The park and ride facility of about 70 is now full. So my question to you, Peter, in terms of the split between public transport and other forms of transport, we haven't been meeting the targeted split between the two. We haven't been spending enough on public transport. Will we be spending more in the future so that improved facilities will exist to encourage park and ride and encourage to improve this access, where people can perhaps come in from a rural position and then use the benefits of public transport to save on a long-term journey?
Okay, thank you. There's a number of different aspects to the question. As it happens, the way we deliver park and ride, it's actually coming out of the roads budget. The park and ride facilities come out of the roads budget. So there's been no underinvestment in park and ride. In fact, we've been actively pursuing the extension of park and ride. David mentioned we're coming up towards 8,000 park and ride spaces now across Northern Ireland. So that's the first point.
Do you accept in many places those that you built are full?
And it may well be that there is a need to do more, and that's what we're looking at opportunities all of the time at where we can expand that opportunity. The second point is that we've actually seen a very significant rise in real terms in terms of the investment in public transport. I think I said it was 85% over the period of the RTS. So just comparing the amounts isn't just the trick. The fact is that both amounts have been growing over that period because there was such a substantial need because of the
significant increase, but it's less than target. Would you accept it's less than target?
I accept that the percentage has been less than was set out in the RTS. But the point I want to make is that I don't think this is about setting road users, car users against public transport users. This is about trying to deliver a suitable service for both and suitable infrastructure for both. That was what the purpose in the regional transportation strategy that Peter Robinson launched in 2001. That's where that was coming from, and that remains, I think, an important driver. Now, where we have particular problems with congestion, particularly in Belfast city centre, then I think there are issues about whether we cannot find ways of enhancing the use of public transport in those areas in order to make car use less attractive. And Belfast on the Move was unpopular at the time it was done because that's essentially the steps that it was taking at that time. Belfast Rapid Transit will see a further extension of that in terms of the growth of bus lanes and as David has said, plans to try to enforce bus lanes more rigorously, and on all of those things will all impact in terms of those periods of areas of greatest congestion, with an attempt to ensure that public transport is a viable alternative, that it is in terms of time, in terms of accessibility, in terms of comfort and in terms of cost, as has already been covered.
Can I just ask, why are you why is park and ride facilities in the roads budget if it's actually helping public transport? Is that not illogical?
It's just a function of the particular team that delivers the park and ride works within Transport NI. It's a seamless service in the sense that it's all joined up. It doesn't really matter where the money comes from. It just happens to be where it happens to sit.
Okay. Deputy Chairperson, you finished your questions? Yeah.
I think maybe you've already covered it. It's the 5-year delay in the rapid transport service. I mean, who expresses concerns about these delays? Is this something, Mr. Strahan, your board of directors might be screaming from the rooftops about, or are they just doing the mundane things?
In respect of the delay, that department is responsible for when the scheme goes live. We are the operator who will operate it once it goes live. So, if you don't mind, I'll ask that to the.
I think.
Sorry, before you answer, I'm getting the distinct impression, sitting here since 2 o'clock, that nobody challenges anything, either between the Department of Transport or this board of directors. Who actually asks you what you're doing, or more importantly, what you're not doing? Who scrutinises it?
If you want to ask about the scrutiny and the governance that's placed over TransLink, I think David would say that there's a very rigorous governance set of arrangements that are in place that are driven by the department from the minister down. There's a sponsor division that has regular meetings. I go to triennial meetings with the board to hold them to account in terms of.
Peter, tell us more about this board, because I'm at a loss. Do they challenge you?
Well, they will offer challenges. They've offered a series of challenges around the
minutes on
the
the
budget
website for several months.
Well, I'm not aware of that detail, but around the budget, there was a series of challenges offered by TransLink about the impact that was going to have on their business. The board was instrumental in driving that forward, and there remain conversations about finance as we go forward. But our governance regime is about ensuring that TransLink delivers against the objectives the Minister has set. So that's our focus, and we expect and work to ensure that the directors on the board of TransLink are active in the role that they play, and that they are over what's going on.
Do they get training and all that?
All members of public bodies get training. They get induction in terms of the business itself and training about their role as board members.
No more questions.
Okay, thank you. Sean, it's your area.
Just going back to the regional transport strategy. When I look at it, there are 2 or 3 issues. One, 2002, where it was getting quite dated.
Yep. 2,
it was designed really on coming from a UK context, where if we look at, when Danny talks about infrastructure, but if we look at the roads infrastructure or the rails infrastructure, if we look in the UK, and particularly in English, as opposed to Northern Ireland, it's totally different. But 3, there was no, it didn't contain a separate strategy for public transport. Is that right?
Well, I've got the regional transportation strategy here. I think your first comment is that it is now some time ago that the RTS was set, and since then there's been a document called the New Approach, which has set out an update, and I'm going to ask Tom, who's been sitting patiently, to say something more about that in a moment. The second point you made was to say that you thought that the RTS was based on GB practice, and I would disagree with that. It was set under the then Minister Peter Robinson. It was very much to meet Northern Ireland's needs. It's been carried forward by successive ministers from different parties across the executive. And I think that the focus on trying to get out from under what was a serious issue in terms of the structure and the quality of the infrastructure in both roads and public transport was something that was designed to meet Northern Ireland's needs and does meet Northern Ireland's needs. Within the RTS, there are core aspects that relate to public transport. There is not a separate strategy for public transport within that. But I'm going to ask Tom to say something about the new approach and the steps going forward in terms of strategy.
I mean, I think the important thing, first of all, is to go back to the RTS and why it's an integrated strategy. And the RTS was developed at the time. It was very clear. The aim was to address what was then a very significant infrastructure deficit, which had resulted from years of underinvestment in roads and public transport. And the success of the RTS has really been enabling us to start to address that deficit. But there's still a significant amount of work that needs to happen there, particularly in relation to the strategic road network, particularly in the west. The new approach, we started reviewing the RTS, I think it was approximately 2007. And at that stage, it became very clear the level of population growth, the level of economic growth had been much faster than anyone had anticipated in 2001, 2002. So what we've set out in the new approach is, in effect, it's a reaffirmation of the direction that was set in the RTS, but a recognition that actually our ambitions have to be higher than they were when the RTS was set. And in particular, there needs to be more of a focus on modal shift. Because as Peter's highlighted, where the RTS promoted sustainable transport, it didn't set a specific target for modal shift at that time. The focus was primarily on getting the investment done to the roads and public transport infrastructure. And in relation to going forward, what we've set out in the RTS is a commitment to introduce a slightly different approach in terms of how we prioritise transport interventions. And again, it's trying to support this aim of an integrated approach. So we're not separating investment in roads or public transport. We're looking at what are the transport needs of Northern Ireland and how do we best meet those. And we do that by looking, first of all, at what are the main priorities, what are the main objectives we're trying to achieve for transport, and then to what degree do various transport interventions contribute to that, and how can we frame them in a way that we maximise the benefits. One example of that, for example, is modal shift. If we assess various transport interventions and the degree to which they contribute to modal shift, what we find is public transport obviously scores quite well. But if you start to look at roads-based schemes which are critical to regional connectivity, you can then see there are opportunities actually in those to build in public transport access through the likes of park and ride. And those opportunities are enhanced by the fact that the vast majority of people in Northern Ireland actually travel on a strategic road network for commuting purposes. So what we're looking to do going forward with a lot of the major schemes is build park and ride onto those, and also take forward the enhancement of public transport services on those key routes where there's greatest opportunity to bring people on to public transport.
And when we talk about this whole transport strategy, where does it come in terms of, like, I drive in the Saintfield Road every day, and sometimes I go home with M1 just for a change of scenery or whatever. But I'm as guilty as the rest. I'm sitting there, one person in my car. Yeah. What has been done when we look at some other countries, particularly in Canada, to, for example, incentivise, for example, car sharing and so on? Where does that fit in this new approach, this new strategy?
It's the critical area you want to target, is single occupancy car use. What we've seen in Northern Ireland, if we can go back to 1990, but it's been particularly evident from around about 2000, the period of rapid economic growth we had here was associated with a huge increase in car ownership. The number of cars on the road more than doubled. And if we look at the data in the travel survey in Northern Ireland, what we tend to see is people aren't actually making that many journeys by car, but they're making more of those journeys as a driver rather than a passenger. So we're seeing that increase in single occupancy car use. Now, there are various initiatives we've taken forward over the years. One is obviously it's the Northern Ireland Car Share scheme, which promotes car share, and within the department we promote that. We reserve a certain amount of parking within Clarence Court for the car share scheme. Other ways we've tried to tackle this is through the introduction of the Tax Smart scheme for public transport, which significantly reduces the cost of public transport tickets for employees, and through the bike travel to work or bike to work scheme, I think it's called, as well within the department. One of the big challenges we have is that if you're going to drive modal shift and you're going to tackle single occupancy car use, there's a need to address some of the demand management measures, and in particular the availability and cost of parking. And that was highlighted in the RTS. It was highlighted again in the strategic review of park and ride within the department. and indeed we've also highlighted it in the new approach. The difficulty with that is all three documents recognise this is something you can only take forward where there's public or political will to do that. And to date, for various reasons, that I think the economic downturn actually had an impact here as well, that public and political support hasn't been there. So that's something we're looking to build going forward.
Thank you. And maybe just to move to one or two specific things from the report. In part, okay, right.
You're talking about that modal shift and the integrated transport. It's interesting, and I actually meant to raise this. I think you were at the committee last week, Peter, or a couple of weeks ago. Certainly, your Translink were there. One of the researchers for the committee took his bicycle to Newry and tried to get onto the train and was refused. So we have cycle to work schemes and with people trying to actually encourage them to use their cycles. And he was told, no, you can't get it on the train, you must take it in the bus.
Right, I think David can answer that.
I think at peak hours, there is a restriction on buses on trains, cycles on trains.
So there's a contradiction right away. There's a contradiction in that methodology. Because how do you call something a cycle to work, where someone's going to cycle to work at peak time, but you can't take public transport?
So there is a restriction at peak hours. There isn't a restriction on the number of folding cycles that can be used on trains. However, the reality is the train from Newry at peak hours, there are people standing on it. So then, if we have, if we have an unlimited number of cycles on the train, that takes up the room for 2 or 3 passengers. So there's a real, if you like, there's an issue for us in terms of the balance we achieve between the number of cycles that are permitted on trains and the number of passengers we allow on, because ultimately if we have more cycles on trains then we have fewer passengers. But there's also... Do you see,
sorry, David, I'm cutting across. Do you see the manager to ratio that you have within your organisation, and you're one of the highest? You talk about, we talked about earlier about the comfort in the trains and reliability. You're now saying the Newry train, there's people standing on it. At what stage would they ever consider putting another carriage on so as everyone could have a seat? And we could accommodate those who actually want to bring their bicycles.
We within the existing resources we have, we could not facilitate a seat for everyone at peak hours on our rail infrastructure. We would need to be investing, and I don't know the number, but we would need to be investing in a significant number of new carriages, which will bring with it a significant capital cost. That's been the success of the railway growth in terms of passenger numbers.
But there's also a contradiction. I think the Cycle to Work scheme is an excellent scheme. I think more we encourage people to get onto other forms of transport and leave the cars. But we can't have the organisation responsible for public transport in Northern Ireland saying, no, busy time of the day, we don't want you today.
Well,
you leave your Cycle to Work scheme bicycle at home and take the car.
What we do provide is facilities at our railway stations for people to park their bicycles, and we now know, and it's been launched this week with much fanfare in respect of the cycle scheme in Belfast and the access to bicycles in the city centre. So I accept it's a challenge, and it's something we're trying to grapple with, and it's something we've never ruled out reviewing in the future. But the issue we have is if we allow a significant number of cycles on trains at peak hours, without a doubt we're carrying significantly less passenger numbers. And the reality is we don't have enough carriages in terms of our railway rolling stock to provide everyone with a seat. And actually that's someone who's lived for 2 years in Britain. Regularly I was in the train from Chester to Euston, and people standing for, in excess of an hour that didn't have a seat. Now that's unheard of in Northern Ireland, and people, and rightly so, don't like having to stand, rightly so. But public transport in other places, that's a common occurrence. I think it shows the success and the growth in passenger numbers we've seen in railways, that is now a common occurrence in Northern Ireland. But it is something we grapple with.
Sorry, Sean Dahy just wanted on there first. Brief supplementary.
No, the way I look at the issue of the spaces on the trains for cyclists is that at peak time in the morning, NI Railways is willing to provide spaces for thousands of commuters, but aren't willing to provide one single space for a cyclist. And I think if you look at other jurisdictions, the design is different, because if you're parking up your bike on a train, the way you secure it is through 5 seats. So the pedestrians come on and say, that bugger's taking 5 seats away where I have to stand. So it's badly designed, and that automatically sets the cyclists against the pedestrians. Especially saying a couple come on with a child or a buggy, then I've seen conflict on the train because of that. So it's a bad design there. I've seen other trains where you can put the bicycles up vertically and can be secured, and they're not designed over seats. So I think you need to create space on the trains for cyclists, which isn't clearly taken away from those who actually sit on the trains. And I've been in trains. I've been on the Derry Railway many times. I've never been refused, to be fair, and I've had to stand with the bicycle at times, and I don't mind, to be honest. So I think that is a policy that really does annoy cyclists, and it sends out a message too that they're not welcome on the trains, and it does deter cyclists. It makes them seem second class. So you need to provide some space on the train for cyclists at all times, and not just outside peak times.
There may well be more we can do in terms of education, because actually on our trains there is a designated area for cycles to be stored. So I take the point. Perhaps there's more we can do in terms of education and pointing cyclists to the correct way, because if someone's parking their bicycle across a number of seats, obviously that's not something we wish to see. But yeah, I recognise it's a difficulty, and certainly there is absolutely no desire on our part to discourage cyclists from using the railways. The issue we have is the space issue, but certainly if we're not pointing people to how best to store their cycle on the train, then we should do that, and we should take that away and look at what we can do to educate and work with cyclists.
One small point in terms of the bus routes as well. I mean, you take an example such as Dungiven, the 212 from Derry to Belfast. Saying you did want to take your bike from 5 miles out the road, to make that rural. Say you haven't got a car, and you want to take the bike for part of your journey and then use the bus. There's nowhere safe to secure the bike. So I think that in terms of those main bus routes as well, and some of the stations as well, there's no adequate cycling parking facilities. There's nothing secure, certainly. So I think that's something, there's a huge gap there that needs to look at, because cyclists will not even consider that. People won't consider that as an option if there's nowhere to lock your bike.
Yeah, I think that's actually one of the areas we're looking at in terms of park and ride, and building safe and secure cycling provision into park and ride. I mean, as David pointed out, we did have the issue, and we recognised it was an issue of capacity in terms of trying to take bikes onto trains. And one of the ways to deal with that was to build bike parking in a number of the stations. And a key aim of or a key benefit associated with the introduction of the Belfast Bike Hire Scheme this week has been that people can use the bike to get to the train, travel to Belfast, and then use the Bike Hire Scheme once they're in Belfast.
Apologies, Sean, continue. Yeah.
Just a few specifics. Page 34, paragraph 4.5. The department, the set targets in terms of the increase in passenger numbers with the Metro and with Northern Ireland Rail. Why were no targets set for Ulsterbus?
Well, there was too much uncertainty at the time about how rural bus services were going to be delivered going forward for a target to be set, is what is said in the regional transportation strategy. I think at that time it wasn't clear how, for example, community transport providers were going to be integrated with the provision of Ulsterbus going forward, and so on. So that was the reason that was set. That's in 2001. Obviously, I don't have much detail behind the reasons, but I think it was, what it says is there was just too much uncertainty to be able to sensibly set a target.
Surely the records were there in terms of numbers on the buses. It wouldn't have been impossible to set
and the report actually draws out the decline there was in the use of buses in the 5 years running up to 2001. So there was a clear decline. There was a clear statement about an overall desire to increase and to reverse that decline and increase it. But it was about, and it was possible to set a target specifically for Metro. I think actually some Metro services Ulsterbus may have transferred some of its services into Metro, and that may be part of Sorry, and Tom, you want to add to that? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we look at the RTS, it suggests that rural transport services would be taken forward through a combination of conventional Ulster bus type services, the development of community transport services, and the development of more innovative, flexible, demand-responsive services. And at the time, it was felt it would be impractical to try and sort of make an assessment of the degree of growth or passenger numbers you could achieve in those. But what we did instead in the RTS was go back to what the objective of the policy, which was really about safeguarding services in those areas, and the target therefore focused on bus age to try and improve the infrastructure itself, and the target also committed to the introduction of additional services to improve access during the day.
So then when the Northern Ireland Audit Office decided to use the 2000-2001 figures, you said these were inappropriate. Is this a reason why?
Yeah.
Okay. So can I go to paragraph 429? And that is figure 15 on page 44. It shows that over the decade in other countries, in England and Wales, they've managed a more significant movement towards public transport and away from the car. What can we here learn from experiences in England and Wales?
Well, we look to do benchmarking in a range of ways against providers elsewhere in these islands and to learn lessons from that. I think Tom actually pretty much hit the nail on the head earlier. I think in other parts there has been a willingness to be, if I put it this time, be more brutal about the approach taken to car users by significantly reducing the amount of car parking available in city centres, by taking other steps that are designed specifically to make it more attractive to take public transport. And in any society, you go as fast as there is a will to do so. And I think at this stage, we're still building that will to take some of those further steps. I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, I mean, there's the issue of will. One of the other big challenges we have is population density in Northern Ireland, and the Audit Office reports highlights that as a key determinant of the ability to deliver public transport. And it's worth putting in context that research suggests you need a population density of somewhere between 50 to 80 people per hectare to make public transport financially viable. Anything below 30 almost rules out viable commercial public transport. Our most densely populated part of Northern Ireland is Belfast. We have 25 people per hectare in Belfast. Once we get outside Belfast, we have very, very low levels of population density, which make it difficult to deliver a public transport system to meet needs. What we've tried to do to address that is focus on where we can get the concentrations of population. So those points on where people in rural areas, for example, will access the strategic network, which is the build-up of park and ride, Gold Liner service to try and help address that. But population density does create difficulties. If you compare us with England or Wales or Scotland, the key thing in Scotland is the majority of the population lives in a major urban belt between Glasgow and Edinburgh. So there's the opportunities there to deliver public transport in a way that we simply can't in Northern Ireland. Whilst in England itself, we are dealing with a largely urban-based society.
But do you get my difficulty I have with it, that when you have no targets, it's very hard to monitor it. So then, how can we really measure this if no targets?
I think in terms of modal shift, we've set the commitment in the new approach that we will be setting modal shift targets at both Northern Ireland and Belfast level going forward.
And just when we talk about modal shift and talk about car parking spaces and so on, are you sending out mixed messages in terms of that we're creating park and ride sites and bus lanes, but at the same time we're increasing the number of car parking spaces in the city centre?
Well, there's no increase in the number of car parking spaces other than through private providers. There's no public increase. Off-street car parks have just been transferred to councils as they are. But for councils to decide what they do with those, we will obviously seek to influence that in terms of the wider transportation policy. But it's not that there's been an increase, it's that there hasn't been an attempt to deliberately reduce the number of car parking spaces, for example, in Belfast.
But Sure, you're very aware of the major developments within Belfast, whether it's Victoria Centre or wherever.
If private providers seek to provide car parks, I think there's a limit to what government can or should aim to do about that.
Well, then, should there not be a case, if we want to incentivise the idea of using park and ride, that the number of public car parking spaces were reduced?
Well, there is a case for that. I mean, I think it does go to what's seen to be acceptable to the community and so on. In fact, as has already been highlighted, Park and Ride is very heavily subscribed. It's not that there's a problem in terms of getting people to use Park and Ride. We're already finding in a number of sites, and Mr Begg's already highlighted one in particular where there's a greater demand than there is a supply. So I don't think that if a private sector provider seeks to bring a car park into being, that is not necessarily directly affecting the proportion of people willing to use Park and Ride.
Okay, so then in terms of public servants, you know, how many car parking spaces would be for public servants in Belfast?
Well,
increased?
There are a significant number. Again, I think there's not been an increase, and I know DFP are about to have a review of the number of car parking spaces. As Tom has already highlighted, within DRD, we have sought to take a number of actions specifically in the active travel area. So we already have 50 bike spaces in Clarence Court. We're looking to extend that potentially as much to 150 going forward. We have some car share spaces. Again, we're doing a workplace travel plan at the moment. It's quite likely as a result of that number will be increased, and therefore the number available to single-use drivers will decrease. So we are looking to take our responsibilities seriously and to take a lead in terms of how that all works.
Okay, and finally, in terms of the Northern Ireland Holding Company, do they still own car parks in Belfast City Centre?
David, do you want to comment?
Yes.
Would that then be consistent with their public transport objectives?
Personally, I don't see any conflict. I think if we look at an integrated public transport system, there is a necessity to provide parking spaces for particularly around the enterprise and so on, for people who are travelling to Dublin. And actually the income we get from those car parks is used to subsidise the public transport system. So all of that money doesn't disappear. All of that money is ploughed back into the public transport system. So actually the provision of those car parking spaces subsidises public transport.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Supplementary.
Finance personnel reviewing one of publicly funded car parking spaces for civil servants in the middle of Belfast at present. Can you advise us how many staff from the Department of Regional Development utilise publicly funded car parking spaces in the middle of Belfast when they do not use their car as part of their normal duties? For many, is it a perk rather than an essential requirement?
I know that Clarence Court has a car park, which is the main site that DRD uses in Belfast, has a car park which has, I think, 260 spaces in it. Now, we share that building with colleagues from the Department of the Environment and the Department of Employment and Learning, and I don't have the specific breakdown, but you might say it might be around 200 spaces that are available. The basis upon which people receive spaces is that they're designated as essential users, in other words, that they can demonstrate they have an ongoing need for regular use of the car outside of Belfast. But as I said, we are looking at all of that, and we're looking at how the distribution of car parking spaces works going forward.
And with the review of number of civil servants, are you revising carefully how many actually essentially need that car parking space paid for from limited public funds?
This car park is attached to the building, and it's owned by DFP, but there's no charge other than an opportunity cost as to what the car park could otherwise be used for.
Rent it out to the private sector to use as well?
In theory, so it's an opportunity cost is what I'm saying, rather than a direct charge.
Yeah, thank you.
It's worth noting as well that for those staff who have to travel around Belfast or beyond during the day, we make available the e-car, which we sponsor. So people can come in by public transport if they have a meeting during the day, for example, up here. They can use the e-car, bring it back down to the building, then go home by public transport again. So it's one of the measures we're taking to change the balance.
you. Just on terms of reviews, and that the Belfast to Dublin line. I know there's been some people have said about the efficiency of that. The first train in the morning. It would be beneficial to many people travelling to Dublin from Belfast for early morning meetings to have that service a bit earlier. Mr. Strachan, is there any way that's going to be reviewed in the long term, or?
I think in the very long term, where we want to get to with that line is ideally the electrification of it and a truly hourly service. You will be aware that we are currently in the shorter term. I think that's long term. I think in the shorter term, you will be aware we're seeking to develop the Great Victoria Street site into an integrated transport facility and move the enterprise service to commence from Great Victoria Street, which will make it, if you like, slightly more central than Central Station. I'm not aware of any plans at the moment to put on an earlier service on the Dublin line, but it's something certainly we can consider and I can come back to you on.
Yeah.
Just on
yeah.
The Belfast-Dublin service is supposed to be a fast-speed intercity service between two capital cities. It's not. And increasingly people are choosing buses between Belfast and Dublin because they're faster. When is somebody going to recognise that there's massive investment needed and a proper dedicated line that is not competing with the DART service in the suburbs of Dublin? And why do we have to go abroad to some of the poorest countries in the world to see good transport systems?
Well, you're right. The speed of the Belfast Dublin service is determined by the condition of the track, and if you look at our entire network in Northern Ireland, the average speed I think is somewhere around, or the top speed we reach in Northern Ireland is somewhere between 70 and 90 miles an hour. In Britain, you'll see speeds in excess of 100 miles an hour. You're right to identify that it will require massive investment in the future, and certainly where we want to get to with electrification of the line, that will be massive investment. In the straitened times that we're currently in, obviously there's very hard decisions to be made in respect of priorities for investment.
Just returning to I come here by car. I could go to Ballymun and catch the train, and I could go to Central Station and get a bus then up here, and occasionally do it, but not often. But every morning I have an opportunity, usually outside the city airport or thereabouts, to see thousands of cars heading into Belfast with only one person on them. And then I realise I'm hypocritical about this, because I imagine if I was to ask you how many of you came here by public transport this afternoon, not one of you came. Tom, I'm going to give you 10 out of 10 for that, because you have clearly demonstrated that you absolutely, fundamentally believe in the job you're doing. But there's not enough of you. And that's the problem. There's no point in us sitting here wringing our hands and saying how wonderful it would be if everybody else used public transport except us. How do we do it? Now, I imagine, Tom, you didn't come here because you knew Dalit would ask you how you got here. Tell the world why you did it.
Why did I come here by public transport? Well, John, you know I travel quite a distance in a normal day, and car share in that. And I think the more you travel, the less you actually want to drive. Public transport, you can relax, you can read your papers. It's a much more relaxing way to travel than driving.
Can we hear that message far more often?
I think for people who use public transport, and it's one of the things that shouldn't be missed in the investment that's been taken forward over the RTS. The public transport network's been transformed.
Yes.
We think we can all recall as students travelling home on buses and how uncomfortable and cold it was. It's a wonderful experience now compared to that.
Tom, you're right, because from my position outside the George Best Airport, I'm sitting beside one of the most modern railway links. I mean, this assembly put 40 million into it. Right enough, we should only put 13, and the rest was overspent. And then we put the new trains on it. And yet, thousands of cars are going past. As the train goes past at 70 miles an hour, one person in every one of them.
And that, I think,
is that not failure?
That takes us right back to the point that was made in the RTS. Investment in public transport infrastructure itself is not enough to drive modal shift. You need the demand management measures, but those can only be taken forward where there's a public or political support to do that.
I'd like to burst your bubble, Tom, but I'm going to. But I personally believe there is an inequality, particularly from the rural areas, and I represent the rural area, and you have that pleasure of doing that, but someone coming from a rural area does not. So,
can I point out I actually am coming from a rural area, but it's where parking van west of the Ban. The only reason I can use that service is because of the fantastic investment in Park and Ride and the investment in the Gold Liner service, which has made public transport as quick, as attractive, and in fact cheaper than taking a killer.
Can I ask, if you don't mind asking, what part of the West do you come from? Because just because we have to highlight the good where there is good.
A tiny place high up in the mountains, Swadra.
Not exactly Strabane, but
no, it's not.
Equally as remote, yeah. Well, good point taken. Yeah, Trevor, you're next. Trevor.
Tom, just we're on that subject. Do you enjoy free public transport like all the employees and the families of TransLink?
No.
Right, that's okay. Just want to clear that up. so he slapped us both down today. No, well, I actually, when I looked at your pen profile, and I see you're not actually employed by TransLink, but TransLink employees have an advantage. I think all their staff and all the families get free public transport. So that's why I asked the question. I'll not embarrass you, David, because obviously you didn't confess to coming in public transport today. But I know where you live, and I don't think there's many trains out around that part of, nor buses out around where you live. So.
Sounds ominous.
You know where it is. But let's go back. I do applaud you, and I will always applaud you until you go down in my estimations. You haven't yet. In terms of the work that you have done in your terms in TransLink from November until today. But if we go back to one of the benchmarking graphs where the ratio between management and staff is relatively high, why did it take you to come in from last November to change that, and why was that not recognised by some of your predecessors? Because it's been going on from, obviously, in this graph, it's gone on since 2006. Oh, no, sorry, that's unfair. Why, John, from someone in your department, who should be actually watching how TransLink spend their pennies whenever you're subsidising them, why have someone within regional development not challenged TransLink in their over-bureaucratic organisation in relation to that ratio in comparison to other people who are delivering a similar service?
I think that's a fair question. This was highlighted in the task report, and we have been present TransLink in recent years. I think it's fair to say it's taken the energy in the organisation. David has got to make significant progress now. And I think those are fair questions that there probably should have been a more robust approach by the department in the past in the face of that, particularly when times are tight. Sometimes when resources are plentiful, organisations get a bit complacent.
Yeah, complacency, yes, but just because our pockets are full wouldn't necessarily mean that we should be extravagant in the wrong areas.
No, you're absolutely right.
And you've been about since 2010, so I can't pick on you.
No, you can't. I
can definitely.
Not since 2010.
I feel you've got it reasonably easy today. So
I know, but I haven't been here since 2010. So.
Oh, have you not? Sorry.
I know. When did you come? January last year.
All right, sorry. So I can't pick on you, John. So no, really, I mean, all joking aside, the organisation has came from a position in 2006, in terms of this report of 2011, is taking the change of the leadership and in relation to the chief executive of that organisation to look at that efficiency. And that only came because he had a challenged financial position that has been passed down. And I know you're doing that, David, but I think it focuses minds, or maybe the timing and you coming into post. But what is clear, what is very, very clear, is whoever done the job prior to you didn't do it, didn't recognise that efficiencies within the organisation could have been found. Because if you look at some of the partners who are doing this in other areas, the ratio is there. It's there to be seen. And we're operating at 5 times worse than some of the best.
Some of those ratios, I think, are a bit misleading because the providers provide services to more than one area, and they will have a head office somewhere which may not be in that area, and they may have quite limited management on costs. So while I think we accept, and I think Transnic accept, that there's more that can be done in terms, and that's why they're taking the action they are in relation to management costs, I think some of those graphs in the report can be misleading in that they don't represent true like-for-like comparisons.
I'll give you that one, Peter. However, and seeing as we are on the public record, Northern Ireland versus all those other ones are the worst. And the average of all those other ones are probably, we're still sitting at double. And I'm
not hiding the fact that there is work to be done. That's why there was a task report done, I think, in 2013 that identified the need to meet management savings. David already was working up a plan to deliver significant savings in year. It is true that that plan has been extended and expanded to meet some of the financial pressures in year, to go beyond where you planned originally to go. But you know, action was already being taken before the financial downturn hit.
Yeah, and that was just the point. That's why the change in management structure was already gathering pace prior to the financial cuts. It's made all the more important by the financial pressures we're facing, and it's timely now that we're doing it. It may be worth highlighting that we're seeking to take out around up to 60 individuals from the management and administration overhead of the organisation. We've launched a voluntary exit scheme. The expression of interest for that closed, I think, roughly 2 to 3 weeks ago. We've had around 210 expressions of interest. So I'm reasonably confident that we will achieve the 3.1 million we've set out to achieve.
Yeah, and I think that's important to get that on the public record, because the media are very quick to say that, yes, whilst you or others will identify that we can streamline organisations, I think the key in all of this is, as you have said, that you're in a situation where you have 260 applications. I presume you don't need it. Sorry, 210. Sorry, 210. How many do you need?
We're seeking up to 60.
You know, so you're almost 4 times what your initial requirement is. The point I'm trying to make, David, and that's why I think it's important to get it on public record, because the media do like to twist this, that TransLink is axing some of their workers. This is a voluntary scheme.
Yes.
This is a voluntary scheme. Yeah. And this is a restructuring of an organisation that will bring about efficiencies that should have been there previously. However, we are where we are. But I think it's important. I mean, many out there like to scaremonger on how we actually arrive and how you and other organisations will arrive at that. And that has to be applauded. But the 210 applications said that there's people within the organisation, to me, that's what it said to me, there's 210 people who are actively interested, not necessarily saying they'll follow through, but there's a genuine interest in the particular scheme.
Yes. And just since we are on public record, just to be, because I like to be really clear, as everyone knows, so we're seeking up to 60. There's been 210 expressions of interest. Those individuals are now receiving their statements, which will indicate what it means for them if they were to go, and then once they receive that, then they put up their hand and say, yes, I want to go, or no, I don't. So it's 210 expressions of interest. But I'm encouraged by the fact that it's well oversubscribed, and I'm very optimistic and positive that we'll achieve the savings that we want to achieve. Well, and I'm determined to achieve the savings we want to achieve.
Because I'm only making another point on this one. And I think local government should be applauded, because they did see what was coming in relation to the review of public administrations. And I know some of them where senior management positions became vacant, or senior, management directors, senior positions, there's nearly like an embargo on actually filling those positions. Right. So again, efficiencies were done within the local government sector by actually not employing places to fill places. What's your position in relation to Ulster Bus at the moment?
Well,
or translate?
we've had a recruitment freeze in place. I can't tell you the exact date, but it was within a number of days or within a couple of weeks of my joining the organisation, so it would have been around November, December last year. We're seeking to reduce our workforce in the least costly way possible. So recruitment freeze has been in place, albeit where our role is essential. There's an approval process to go through to make sure that that position is filled.
Thank you.
Roy, you want to?
I'm not really satisfied for the answers that you've given to Trevor here. Trevor posed the question, why was you so slow to change this? And John McGrath said this is a reasonable question to ask, but I didn't hear the answer. I didn't hear the answer why. There are many senior staff within the Department of Regional Development who are well paid, who ought to have been aware that TransLink have had twice as much paid towards management in their bus services as their comparators. Similarly, Lithgow Board, why did they not bring about efficiencies? So my question to the Permanent Secretary, you ultimately are responsible for this. And we're not talking about just going back for a year or two, the cuts come in. If you look at the figures going back to 2006, if you compare Ulsterbus with Stagecoach Devon, Stagecoach Scotland, Arriva Cumbria, they're operating at almost twice the level of management costs as those similar bodies. So can I ask the Permanent Secretary, what have you and your department, what responsibility do you hold for this?
Well, the department, I think there are some differences in the figures that I've already explained. I think the other difference, the other key difference...
Are there any differences in Stagecoach Scotland? Or is there a headquarters outside of Scotland?
So Stagecoach Scotland...
We've been given...
The Stagecoach Devon, the Stagecoach in Lincolnshire. I don't know where the headquarters are. I would need to go and explore that.
Comparative groups. And from what I can see, we're the worst, but not only that, we're well below the average. So we're not picking out individual areas. Yeah. Do you accept these as being reasonable comparators?
I've explained why I think that they do offer a distorted picture, but I've also said that...
Or just first Devon and Cornwall?
Well, some of them at least. I don't know. I haven't gone into the detail of each of them.
You don't know. You're telling us that the headquarter costs elsewhere, and you're telling us now you don't know.
Just like to, I'm quite happy to answer the question.
Can you tell me which of these have headquarter basis costs outside of the region?
Well, first Devon and Cornwall do. I'm not clear as to how the Stagecoach management structure works, but the fact that there are 3 Stagecoach areas suggests that there will be a head office for Stagecoach somewhere else in addition to management costs on the ground. Well, I'm very happy to go and explore that in greater detail in due course and to come back to you and explain how that all works. The report that was done by the Department in 2013, or commissioned by the Department in 2013, is what has shone a light on this, and action has been taken since then. I'm not in a position to explain what knowledge there was about relative management costs prior to that. I think that there wasn't visibility before that, otherwise action would have been taken at that point.
Do you accept that that is a failure in senior civil servants and Lithgow Board? We're talking going back to 2006. You look at the figures going back to 2006.
It depends whether that data was available. This data is from a report
should you not be asking for data to be available? Should you not have been asking? Would that not have been a reasonable job to do? How does our management costs compare with comparative areas? Would that not have been a reasonable thing to have done?
Since some of us weren't there at the time, but I agree it is a not unreasonable question to ask.
And what's the answer?
Well, I suspect the question was being asked and that there were difficulties in comparing like with like, and therefore there was a bit of smoke and mirrors, and it was quite hard to identify what the position was until this report was undertaken, and then there was a greater clarity.
Will you ensure us in the future that you will be comparing yourselves with comparable bodies and not using that as a bit of a smokescreen to just not see how you can improve efficiency and provide a better service at a better value for Ulster Bus users?
One of the recommendations in this report goes to benchmarking, and I've said we're accepting all of the recommendations, so very happy to offer that commitment.
Thank you.
Laurie, do you want to ask your question?
Okay. Looking at figures 27 and 34, in terms of benchmarking, again, in this area of benchmarking, and the performance of both Ulster Bus and Northern Ireland Railways. It's quite striking, the differences. We're talking about paragraph 5.32 and 5.48, and I'm just trying to turn them up myself in the document.
They show quite different levels of satisfaction in relation to Metro Bus and Northern Ireland Rail against comparators.
Yeah. So I'm trying to understand why one section of the organisation in providing public transport is showing very good results. I'm talking about Northern Railways in terms of customer quality of service parameters, punctuality, cleanliness, comfort, a whole lot of practical measures, helpfulness of staff and value for money. Northern Ireland Railways is coming out in the upper echelons of comparative organisations when comparing to other rail services in the United Kingdom. So a very good result for Northern Ireland Railways. But when we go to metro services, the converse. And really what I'm trying to understand is why is there such a difference between the two organisations?
Well, I think we've covered some of the reasons already. I'm going to ask David to say a bit more in detail about it.
Yes. We don't believe it's normal practice to compare bus and rail services. Generally, you benchmark bus with bus and rail with rail. However, notwithstanding that, it is a very helpful comparison. There are factors in respect of Northern Ireland Railways which are entirely under our control. So, for example, in punctuality, we have much greater control over the punctuality of our rail services than we do in bus, where there are much more factors, external factors, if you like, that can affect the punctuality of bus services. But notwithstanding that, we do believe that internally in our organisation there are learnings for our bus business, if you like, from the railways, and that's what the new integrated management is designed to achieve. So the internal workings of TransLink in the past has been a bus division and a rail division, which, if you like, have been managed separately. What I'm seeking to do in the restructuring of our organisation is to make sure we've got an integrated management, and that we make sure that the learnings for bus are brought across from the rail side of the business, if you like. And I hope in the future that we internally in TransLink don't refer to a bus business and a rail business, that we talk about a TransLink business, and that we achieve greater integration. So I do accept there are things we can learn in the bus side of the business. However, it is a very different business, not only in respect of the external influences, but also the fact that our bus drivers are working on their own for long periods of time, and that creates its own customer service challenges. But I do accept there are learnings.
In terms of punctuality, you indicated that some of the issues are outside your own control, traffic flow, etc. But when mention was made earlier of a cashless payment system, that's clearly within your control, and that's something which could improve your punctuality without impinging on other road users. So why is it taking so long to move towards a cashless system?
I think what we've been seeking to do is sweat the asset that we have. A new ticketing system is a significant, very significant investment. It will be somewhere of the order of £30 to £40 million. So what we've been seeking to do is sweat the asset we have in place. We now recognise that, yes, the world has moved on, number one, and number two, our system we have is not outdated, but it's reaching the end of its useful life. So what we're seeking to do is procure a new system which will make boarding times much faster and will move people away from cash. The percentage of our passengers paying by cash is too high, and we want to encourage people off cash because it's actually cheaper to pay using a card. So we're seeking to do that not only by our fare structure but also by an education programme. And then the new integrated ticketing system will make it much easier to use cards.
In terms of justifying the new system, is that something that TransLink have to build into your own capital programme, or is that something that the department builds into the programme?
It's some.
I think given Translink's facing some quite significant financial pressures in the past, it has been able to self-fund quite significant amounts of its own capital, but not the big projects. A project of this scale, I think you said 30 to 40 million, you'd always be looking for some input from the department. Given where Translink now is, not least because we reduced the level of grant last year and have reduced it further this year, Translink will be pretty much entirely dependent going forward on departmental funding for big major capital events. So integrated ticketing is one of them. The means of running BRT and the consequences of BRT in terms of the whole sort of back office piece for Translink and the Belfast Transport Hub are all areas where Translink are going to be looking to the department for funding going forward.
And can the one ticketless system provide the technology for both Translink and the new integrated, the new high-speed travel systems in Belfast?
Yes.
Okay. And does the department recognise that whilst it may be the tens of millions of pounds in terms of the potential and punctuality and ultimate passenger experience, the costs may well show value for money, in that the cost to make physical improvements to the road and achieve that may even cost more?
Well, we're already investing in the routes themselves, of course, and putting money into those routes. We do see these areas as priorities going forward. We don't get to control what level of budget we're set by the executive, so I can't give a guarantee that we'll find the funding, but what I can say is that these are priority areas, and our current minister would be keen to find the money to support these initiatives.
Just one further one. In terms of the ranking of Metro bus service, it came 7th out of the I think it was 8 comparable regions in terms of cleanliness, and yet that was an issue which Northern Railways scored very highly on, coming second out of its comparative areas. Is there what lesson can come from that? Because essentially they're all Translink staff, and how are you going to ensure that customer satisfaction is greatly improved, so that they feel encouraged to continue to use bus and rail services?
Yes, I think the presentation of our bus fleet is something that is very important, and the cleanliness of it and how it's presented to our passengers is vitally important. I absolutely recognise that based on this, it's not acceptable. And we will be taking forward measures in order to address that. Again, I don't mean to hark back to our restructuring, but our restructuring is designed to make sure that there is a very clear line of responsibility for the presentation of our fleet within our organisation. So I'm hopeful in the future that that will show a much better ranking in terms of cleanliness.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Before I let in our next member, Mr. Mackay, can I just ask a question, David, maybe to yourself, David, and the department, just in terms of, and I know the report doesn't cover this, but it does cover customer satisfaction. I'm just a bit anxious to know what, or if any, of the buses have the voice automated for people who are blind or sight impairment. Does any of our buses have that in place?
Yes, they do. The numbers of them, I couldn't give you, Chair, off the top of my head, and I wouldn't wish to do so, because I think it would be misleading. If you wish, I can confirm that post the meeting, but that's something we have invested in.
Yeah, and just on that, what investment has there been within the structure of our buses for people with disabilities?
Well, quite a significant amount of investment. If you look at our new bus fleet, they are wheelchair accessible, and generally, in fact, they all have a specific area for wheelchair users, and they're also kneeling buses that makes entry onto our buses much more easy. So that's now part of our DNA to make sure that our services are accessible.
Okay, thank you. And if you could provide me with the number of those buses. Dahi?
Thanks, Chair. Just in terms of the breakdown in public transport funding and roads funding, I mean, obviously the RTS planned expenditure was 62% roads and 35% public transport, and public transport came in at 28% and roads was 70%, which was hugely disappointing in my view. We then go on to, I think, 2013-14, and that showed that it was a divide of 85% roads and 15% public transport, and then because of what happened with the A5, it came in more favourably at 77-23. So it doesn't appear to me to be improving, and certainly if you look at the figures in terms of the amount of public transport expenditure per head, we're at the bottom of the pile, whereas Scotland is soaring ahead. Do we have any figures in terms of 14-15, or any estimates of what the percentage breakdown would be for that year?
I can write to you with the figures are readily available. I just don't have them with me today.
But are they any better?
I don't think they show a significant difference. I don't think they show a significant difference. As I said, part of the purpose of the RTS was to increase investment against both areas, because there was a problem with the infrastructure, both in roads and in public transport. And in part, at least, we respond to priorities that are set. Some of them are executive priorities about major road schemes. There's a particular focus on ensuring connectivity between our major towns and cities at the moment, which is why the main focus has been on the A8, the A5, the A6 and so on, and there's been a significant investment in the A1 during the period of the regional transportation strategy. All of those have some benefit for buses in particular, because buses use those routes. There's also been massive investment in public transport over the period. Could more be done? Well, the answer is always yes, and we've highlighted that there are 2 or 3 major public transport initiatives coming forward that are likely to require a shift in the overall distribution if they're to be delivered. So we'll have to see what priorities ministers and the executive set going forward.
Would you accept then that in terms of investment in public transport, we are the worst of any jurisdiction in both these islands in terms of putting public transport first? So we very clearly put public transport in second place compared to the single car users that John referred to earlier.
Well, I accept the findings of the table, figure 4, I think it is. I'm not arguing that that's an accurate reflection of the per head expenditure in Northern Ireland.
How are we supposed to improve public transport if the funding is going in the wrong direction?
Well, I mean, it's not. It may have gone in the wrong direction in the very last year of that graph, but actually what it shows is that the gap has been closing over the period from 2004 by and large, and while there remains a gap, and some of that gap will be down to the nature of the public transport systems that exist. So at the moment we don't have a rapid transit system, we don't have an underground system, we don't have trams or anything like that. So some other cities have big cities would have different sorts of transport infrastructure, and that would tend to make a difference. But I recognise the point that you're making, and there still remains a gap even after you take that into account.
I think also we need to put the point, I mean, Scotland, as people expect, comes out top, essentially. And there's a general perception that Scotland does better out of Barnet. And then the point Tom made about scale for public transport systems, to invest in that scale, to take advantage of it, you then need to invest, and that's what will be happening. And
I think if you look at the issue of scale, I mean, as Peter says, we don't have underground, we don't have rapid transit systems. We also have a rail network, and David can correct me here, whether it is, I think it's about 300 kilometres or 300 miles, which compares to 24,000 in GB.
Yeah,
and if we look at to maintain a rail network of the size in Northern Ireland we have, takes about £60 million per year just to maintain that rail network. So if we could try and factor that up to what that, that will distort the figures in terms of the need for investment in public transport to maintain the basic asset.
I accept we're starting from a low base. and certainly the decision many years ago to do away with much of the railway network is something that still haunts us all. And that's why it's more frustrating that the figures in terms of public transport investment are so low. I mean, 85% to 15%, given the fact we're starting from a low scale, is totally the wrong priority. And I accept what you say as well. Much of this is down to politicians like ourselves in terms of prioritising roads over public transport. But if you take the example even of the York Street interchange, not something I'm entirely familiar with, the DRD members of the committee would be more familiar with that. But some people have said to me, if you take the amount of money that has been invested in that to address issues of congestion, etc., well, if that money was to go into public transport instead, if that money was to go into some of the greenway proposals, such as the one in East Belfast, then would you not still address the same congestion issue through other measures?
I don't think you would. The greenway in itself is not going to significantly reduce congestion.
Combination, public transport, cars and cycling.
I think the biggest bottleneck, as everybody knows, is around York Street. The driver there is not merely for car users, but is also significantly an economic driver in terms of the passage of freight, lorries and so on. So there are wider economic benefits than purely travel to work times and congestion that are at play. And I think that you're right to say that a decision could be taken to spend all of that money on something else, and that would make a radical difference to the something else that money was spent on. At the moment, the priorities that we're following, set by ministers, are that we are proceeding with the York Street interchange. It won't start for some years, so it is subject to change, obviously, but that's the prioritisation that we're working under at the moment.
But much of this is down to cultural change as well, because I have heard some issues being raised about the design of the York Street interchange, and that cyclists seem to be an afterthought, and there needs to be some changes to ensure that they're accommodated in that, rather than them being treated as a priority or at least equal with other road users.
I've heard similar things, and I've actually took a specific briefing from the officials responsible for the York Street interchange in order to understand the provision of cycling. Now, on the actual multi-carriageway of the West Link running up to the M2, it wouldn't be normal to make significant cycling provision on a road of that nature, but there are very clear cycling arrangements being set aside and enhanced measures that I would hope would come forward in due course. We understand there are still a public inquiry to be gone through and representations to be made, and there's still scope, I think, to secure a greater input for cyclists as a result of that.
And just a quick supplement as well, in terms of the electrification of the Belfast to Dublin line, how much would that cost, and how much of an economic driver would that be, in the same way the York Street interchange would be?
I don't think that there are any detailed costed plans, certainly none that I have seen. I'm going to ask David if he has an estimate, but I think David was right to say this is a long-term proposition. It's not currently in any of our planning horizons as to when. There's no prototype for what that might look like, what it might cost, or when it might be delivered at this stage that I'm aware of.
Yeah, it's aspirational at this point, so there's no detailed capital plan, but you can be sure it's hundreds of millions of pounds, but no detailed plan for that. I think what we're trying to do through the Belfast hub is to make the Belfast-Dublin, and in fact the Derry-Belfast-Dublin route with the Derry-Coleraine line upgraded to make that a more integrated line, and also create greater facility at Great Victoria Street for the Belfast-Dublin service. And in fact, lots of people I meet tell me, why is this service leaving from Central? It should be going from Belfast City Centre, which we agree with, and which the Belfast Hub project will deliver. And I think that will help improve the service.
In terms of the long-term aspiration of the electrification, would that extend to Derry at all, or would it just be Belfast to Dublin?
Well, again, it's going to depend on the availability of capital to the department. I think our focus at the moment is in delivering the upgrade to the Derry Coleraine line that has been subject to much debate. So that's our focus at the moment, improving that service and delivering ultimately the hourly service to Derry that we all want to see.
Thank you. Paul?
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for coming along this afternoon. I really want to focus in on the skills, and it's basically within the report, paragraph 321 through to 325, more or less, with the recommendation therewith. But identifying that there does appear to be skills shortages, even though we do mention about having a large proportion of management, there still appears to be major areas of skills gaps within the organisation to deal with what is one of our main functions of the department. How does the department propose to carry that forward and deal with that in the short term?
Okay, well, thank you for that question. I mean, I think it is an important area. Just to differentiate, we've been talking a lot about management costs in TransLink. This is really about the skills within the department, and we accept that we do need more skills going forward. We have already taken the first steps down that path. There are currently 2 transport planners in post within the department who are working to develop a new transport model. Once that model is in place, we're looking to staff up a transport planning team. Now, in the current context, I have to say that's subject to budget availability, but we estimate that we would need a total of 6 to 10 professionally qualified staff. As a further step, we're bringing in a managed service framework contract, which would allow us to draw on specialist skills as we need, rather than necessarily taking it's not the only approach to employ people. We may look to bring in some specialist skills. We do have specialist skills within the department outside of those 2 transport planners. There are a number of people who came into the organisation as transport planners and have moved into the broader administrative grades, but are still working in this area and still have expertise so they can bring to bear. And I think we have to accept that you tend to go into cycles of transport planning, and the level of resource you need will wax and wane through different stages of that cycle. But I think the report does helpfully highlight that we're at the point where the need for those skills is about to grow, and arguably, we're behind where we need to be in terms of securing those skills.
Thank you for your answer on that, but I find it difficult to comprehend that an organisation which the DRD as a department have a key responsibility in ensuring that our transport areas are dealt with and that our public transport is delivered in a proper function. They've been doing that for many years, yes. So there's a legacy thing here. I'm wondering, why are you only waking up to the fact now, and all I can hear now is additional costs? Why were those not key staff within the existing function? Because it is a key function that the department should have been undertaken and should be undertaken. And to hear that there's going to be an opportunity to call upon experts, I am extremely reluctant to call upon consultants as experts, because many consultants that I know are experts on whatever they've been paid to do, no matter what it is. They will develop or get you somebody who is a so-called expert on it, whether they're an academic or whether they're somebody who's got some real practical experience of delivering it. I'm not totally sold on the idea of getting value for money from consultants. And how can the department adequately ensure that they are managing those consultants right if they don't have the adequate experience within their organisation to do so?
Thank you. I mean, the point I was trying to make was that during the last cycle, we did have a number of transport planners within the organisation, and they're still within the organisation. They're just not working in their professional specialism currently. They're working in the general administrative grades. And we are going to look at how we enhance that level of expertise going forward. We're not going to use management consultants, let me be clear about that. We are talking about professional qualifications that we may have a need for a small amount of time, that it would not make sense to recruit someone into a role on a full-time basis. Tom, I don't know if you want to say something more about how that's going to work.
I think the important thing to highlight as well is that transport planning up until quite recently wasn't a distinct professional qualification. transport planners tended to be chartered engineers or chartered town planners. So if you look at the table within the report, which highlights the number of engineers within the department, quite a few of those will actually have transport planning experience, but transport planning is not the main element of their job at this minute in time. They can draw on that experience, though, because they'll be taking forward projects in relation to the development of public transport infrastructure or roads infrastructure.
But what I would like to see, and there needs to be some measure of this, I've heard of many organisations bringing somebody in to actually, mainly in the private sector, I might say, bringing somebody in to actually help them through a process. But they're learning during that process, so as whenever they ever have to revisit this, they have already built up the skills within their own organisation to be able to do what they paid somebody else to do for them.
I think the important point in this, I mean, as Peter said, we are planning to establish a fully resourced transport planning team, but there will be various stages in project where they need to undertake detailed assessments, and you have to bring in specialist expertise to do that, and that's what the Managed Services Framework allows us to do. Will there be some learning process from that to ensure that you do take on board of it? I think back to what happened, and appreciate that many bad things happened during the Second World War, but certain cities in Germany, and I'm sure many of you have had opportunity to visit some of them, which were virtually obliterated by carpet bombing during the Second World War, used the opportunity to British and American engineers redesign those cities and their transport hubs and everything else around them. And I'm not talking about, it wasn't really rocket science, but there's certain cities in Germany that I've been to where you wouldn't even dream of taking your car into, because the public transport system is that efficient. It probably took a lot of investment initially, but it's that efficient you wouldn't want to use your car. It's cheaper to actually get on and off, and you're sure that within 7 minutes at any one point you're going to get on something. And you know, that's the efficiency has driven it up. That many people now use it. There's no point in trying to bring your car into the city centre. I think Hamburg in particular.
Well, I mean, you can be assured that we will definitely seek to learn from those that we do need to use. The point I would make is that it's not realistic to think that all skills will be available within the department at all times to the level needed. And in any system, particularly at major engineering and transport planning organisations, you do need a mixed economy in order to make things work best to effect.
You did allude to the fact that there are a number of individuals who were recruited with the skills in certain areas who are not making use of those skills. Yes. Those, I would take, will be a matter of ensuring that they will be put into a position where they're going to deal with that.
Well, that's one of the issues.
This is proper workforce planning, where you're going to ensure that you don't have somebody who is, you know, it's like a hospital having the brain surgeon, but we didn't have many jobs for brain surgeons, so he's actually brushing the corridors out there. But we'll bring him back in whenever we need him. I'm wondering.
I can certainly be clear that the people are doing skilled jobs. They may not be doing jobs where they need to use their professional qualifications in the way that they would have done in the past, but we make good use of people. That's one of the areas that we will be looking at, how we use the skills that we already have. But equally, some individuals may have decided on a changing career path, and we need also to recognise and respect individual choice as well as organisational need, and get the right balance there as we go forward.
And in relation to some of those skills areas, will there be adequate, and I believe that there's a challenge role with the department, with TransLink, to ensure that they have the adequate skills and ability to be able to challenge TransLink to ensure that they are meeting their targets or their key objectives?
Well, yeah, that really takes you largely into a different space around governance, and both in terms of financial, the financial way in which TransLink does its business, the achievement of its objectives, and adherence against essentially the management statement of financial memorandum. And we have a sponsor division where I believe we do have the appropriate skills that we need in order to provide that challenge function. And clearly, both John and I are part of that function as well, and we have a key role to play, and we seek to exercise that in a proper fashion.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Paul. John?
Yeah, sorry I was absent for a wee while. Mr. Strachan, others have already complimented you on your performance in the short time. I just want to add my good wishes to you for the future. I think the best man has won, and I wish you all the best. And do take comfort that you will be here until September, and that much of what you plan to change will change. And certainly, if I was to add anything to that, it would be that you can't have an organisation that runs itself. Somebody needs to scrutinise. Somebody needs to ask what's going on. And with the best will in the world and the best staff, and talking about staff, maybe it's an opportunity for me, Chairperson, to pay tribute to the staff who do work both in the trains and in the buses. The one that gets singled out, and the one that gets singled out to me frequently, is the 212 service. People in that bus, women and men, are outstanding. Their customers are their personal friends. They have an interest in them. And that's perhaps one key way in which public transport can become more attractive. In the recent past, I did write to you and ask comment on staff on the Belfast Dairy train, where the same thing happens. So it would sadden me that if one of the economic measures that you were to take was in fact to start making redundancies of the very people who are the backbone of the organisation that you have had the privilege of heading up for a short time. And I hope that the emphasis is on getting more passengers rather than actually culling the whole heart of the organisation. And I don't want to go on too long, but I was a teacher for 30 years, and I know your drivers save children's lives day and daily by stopping them crossing the road, and I think by helping them through their adolescence and all that stuff, and keeping them right. I know time and time again they were honoured for that, but it never got into the news, so I just mentioned it. The whole idea of an agency, which maybe would have to some extent satisfied my concerns that things could be improved, didn't happen. Can you tell me why? Why was the agency idea knocked on the head?
Well, I think that at the time that the proposal came forward, there were two main factors that meant that it wasn't proceeded with. The first was that across the executive, and indeed in the Assembly, I believe, there was a drive not to increase, indeed to seek to reduce the number of non-departmental bodies and executive agencies, and to move to have more direct accountability of the key elements of organisations to ministers and to this Assembly. And the second, as John, I think, outlined earlier, is essentially in relation to finance and different sort of financial environment. And if you want to sort of just expand on that point, John.
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, the passage of time meant that when the agency was being considered, it was in the context when the entire drift in the public sector was going the other direction, to reduce the number of arm's length bodies, and particularly under devolved administration, to get more direct accountability to the executive and to this Assembly, actually. With the cost pressures then coming, and the issues of setting up public body for what we've discussed earlier is actually a small population, and that therefore may well be a body which was not deliver any economies of scale. The judgment was made that that was not a priority. It's still not clear that there's any evidence has been brought forward to suggest that that has been to the detriment of any aspect of the oversight or delivery of the public transport system.
But John, do you not feel, you know, as an experienced civil servant, if we're allowed to use that term, I don't know, there is need for change. It doesn't matter how good the Chief Executive is, there's a sea change needed. And we saw it in the last year, and we'll discuss this separately. We saw the fiasco in the Belfast Dairy upgrade, and we've seen how the Committee for Regional Development gets treated, how the Consumer Council gets treated, not consulted about fare increases. I mean, surely there's something badly missing. And we have a board, which I mentioned at the beginning, a new chairman appointed who's but multiple appointments. I mean, for people like myself and Tom Reid, who absolutely love public transport, what hope there is when you carry on with an outdated, outclapped set-up like that, where nobody challenges nobody?
Well, I don't think we'd accept that nobody challenges nobody. There is rigorous governance.
John, I don't want to talk over you, and that's rude. But I serve on the Regional Development Committee, and we sat for 6 months and didn't know the whole procurement contract was up the left.
Well, we've discussed that in another place, and we've shared as much as we can about what is still a live procurement issue in which the Minister is doing his level best to bring to a conclusion. When that process is concluded, I have little doubt that the committee will get the fullest information that can be made available, and I have no doubt that in this or other settings we will be rehearsing and revisiting those issues. That does not, however, become a symptom of a wider malaise. We've just, as the Minister indicated, we've just concluded a review of the overall governance of all our capital projects and the arrangements for oversight of those across the entire DRD family, and a report on that will be going to the Minister very shortly, and therefore I'm sure will make its way to the Committee for Regional Development. I think it's important not to take individual issues and then assume a wider malaise in an organisation or system. I mean, TransLink has a fairly impressive record of delivery of major capital projects, a fairly sophisticated system of project management of oversight. There have been some lessons that have been taken out of the Coleraine Londonderry thing for the oversight of projects in general in TransLink and the role of the board, and David might want to say something about that.
Chairperson, I know we're coming to the end, and you'll probably adequately sum up what we're discussing, which was the effectiveness of public transport in Northern Ireland. But I wouldn't take away from TransLink anything that they've done positively, and they've done a lot. But there is new challenges now that weren't there before. Yep. And unless there's radical change, we're going to lose the way.
Thank you, Deputy Chairperson. Roy, you wanted in?
Okay. Just to get back on the issue that was discussed earlier in terms of the range of specialist skilled staff, and I look at paragraph 3.22, where the Audit Office had been in discussions with the Transport Scotland and the National Transport, the NTA in the Republic, and they'd highlighted the importance of having a range of specialists available, and stressed the need for in-house expertise, not just the pool when you have a particular demand, and I fully accept that that will be the case, but they stress the need to have some in-house so that, I dare say, the department can understand and have what some of the expertise that may be brought in are saying, and can fully appreciate everything. And you've indicated that you're going from 1 to 2 transport planners. What is the optimum level of transport planners for Northern Ireland?
Well, I think what we expect through the cycle that we're going through is that we'll need to move to somewhere between 6 and 10 in total. That's kind of the our thinking currently. We will need to test that, and as I said, that will need to be tested against the availability of resource to be able to go down that path.
I noticed in the table in Figure 8 that when comparing across the 3 organisations in terms of roads engineers, NTA at 13, Transport Scotland 87, and we are listed as having 138. And well, declaring interest, my son's a student engineer, so he's involved in this area.
Well, yeah.
Can you explain to me what's happening? Why is there such diversity in figures?
I mean, essentially it's different remits. DRD is the roads authority for all of Northern Ireland. Transport Scotland deals with the trunk road network, but the local roads are dealt with by councils, and therefore the engineers aren't counted. Okay. And the NTA has a more restricted still role in respect of the road network. Nearly all of it is devolved to councils. So there are different models, and that's why it's not straightforward to compare across those three organisations as to the functions that DRD perform vis-à-vis Transport Scotland and the Southern Authority. In your earlier answer, you indicated that some of the roads engineers had a degree of planning expertise. Are you able to quantify it? How many full-time equivalent experts would we have, or is there? I think what Tom said was that some civil engineers would have a transport planning expertise, and they would have picked that up. They may have picked that up through road service. I don't think we have a number, and I'm not sure it'd be easy to put that. It's difficult. I mean, I think the issue is before 2005, we didn't have a separate transport plan and professional qualification. So our transport planners tend to be or chartered engineers, I think it is, and chartered town planners. What I can say is there were, I think it was 2 or 3 senior transport planners were involved in the development of the RTS, supported by a team up to about half a dozen, I think it was, junior transport planners. Now, some of those left the department after that, but a number of them are still within the department. It would be very difficult to quantify just how many of the engineers have transport planning experience. You know, the point was being made that a number of those engineers were or would have transport planning experience. When you look at into the future and difficult financial decisions that will have to be made, would you accept that it is important to have expertise and adequate expertise in transport planning, so that all aspects of transport are adequately considered, not just the roads, but the roads, the buses, the trains, the cycle, pedestrians, and that if you don't invest in transport planning, there's a danger that that aspect is missed? I accept absolutely, not just in the context of transport planners, but more generally, we need to have the right expertise within the organisation to deliver going forward. Okay. Thank you, Roy. Before I conclude, if you allow me, just to maybe stray from the report slightly, in relation to some of the concerns that have been raised to me, which are outside of anyone's remit here, and that would be, in fact, and I suppose I'd be asking the question: what do driver training? What's applied to driver training in terms of some of the behaviour of adults on our buses? And it has been brought to my attention recently in terms of individuals travelling on our buses, particularly some of the lewd, disgusting behaviour of adults on our buses. And I'm aware of passenger safety in terms of our driver has to keep his eye on the road and all of the rest. But what training has there been for our bus drivers in the past in terms of being alerted to behaviour of other individuals on our buses? I think David will ask. David, yeah.
All our drivers undergo a comprehensive training programme, not only in respect of the technical requirements of the job, but also in respect of the customer service side of it. I think if it's drawn to our attention that there is illegal or inappropriate behaviour on either our buses or trains, we will take forward action in conjunction with the appropriate authority. So whether that be the police, to actually investigate if there have been criminal proceedings that have taken place. All of our buses are fitted with CCTV, and we make that available to allow prosecutions to take place, and that's happened in the past and something that I'm sure will happen in the future.
Is there any immediate action a bus driver can take if there is an apparent issue on a bus, rather than wait until the destination and then go back on CCTV if a complaint has been made to the driver?
It's really difficult to answer that in a hypothetical environment and not aware of what the specific issue is. I think it will depend very much on what the specific issue is that's taken place.
And I'm saying this because there are people who travel on the buses may feel vulnerable, may feel vulnerable. I'm not saying that that's the case all the time. And if there is an incident arise, that an individual or individuals may want the driver to stop the bus and maybe contact the PSNI or whatever right away, and I'm just asking, does that happen?
I think if an individual has an issue, then they should draw it to the attention of the driver in the first instance,
yes.
And then the driver ought to be able to seek any assistance that is needed for that individual as a result.
Yeah.
It's much harder when the bus driver is trying to work out if there is inappropriate behaviour than if somebody is drawing that inappropriate behaviour to their attention, I think.
Okay, thank you. I suppose just to conclude, Sean?
Chair, it's just a wee point that you made earlier on, and I just want to go back and probably declare an interest that I have 2 daughters that uses this. In terms of the Belfast to Dublin, particularly the Newry part early in the morning, Newry has become a commuter town for Dublin. And really, we have to highlight the things that work well in Northern Ireland Railways, and this is certainly one of them. But if that train could be earlier in the morning, that's 7:45, it takes you into Connolly around 9. There's a good network from Connolly in terms of the Dart and in terms of the Lewis and in terms of taxis or whatever. But the main point is that there will be many more people would use that train if they could be at their desk in Dublin for 9. They're at Connolly for 9. What is the possibility really of looking? That train starts off probably in Central, of that train being earlier, leaving Central earlier in Newry maybe. And I know you work with CIE in Dublin as well, with them as well. They have a 7:30 that leaves Dundalk, but that's not really a benefit for the people around the Newry or South Armagh, South Down that use that service. So I think it's something really worth considering, because it's a great service, but you just need to get into Connolly a bit earlier.
Yeah, I must confess, I don't have the timetable on that service in the back of my head. I thought there was an earlier service, but I confess to not knowing the detail of the schedule. But if you wish, I'll pick it up with the member after.
Yeah.
Because yes, you're right, and one of the things we're taking forward at the moment is the refurbishment of the enterprise trains, and the rollout of that new stock. Well, it's a refurbished stock. Later on this year will mean that's a much better service in terms of the experience for our passengers. So it is a service we're really interested in and we're investing in. But I'm happy to pick up the specific timetabling issue with you.
Yeah, it's just that is only if it
Can I clarify? Are you talking when the train leaves Newry, Sean?
I'm talking about the train that comes from Central. I think it arrives into Newry around, give or take 5 minutes, 7:45.
Yeah. So it leaves Belfast.
But
leaves Belfast at 10 to 7, doesn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
That's the one. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
Deputy Chairperson.
Chairperson, just on the back of that, is this not precisely the sort of thing that a board of directors might be interested in? And am I right in saying that the board of directors that are responsible for TransLink have never met their counterparts in Dublin to discuss the kind of issue that Sean has mentioned?
The board may not have met them, but certainly I met with the Chief Executive of Irish Rail a matter of a couple of weeks ago.
I know there's an election about, people won't answer questions properly, but the answer is...
However, I have met, and there's meetings at operational levels. I met with the Chief Executive of Irish Rail, I think no more than a couple of weeks ago, to discuss a wide range of areas of mutual interest, and the Belfast-Dublin route was one of them. So there are meetings that take place, and you make the point about the board meeting, the Board of Irish Rail, and you're aware of the...
I think it's also worth pointing out that the senior team in Northern Ireland Railways, ourselves, DTAS and Irish Rail do meet on a regular basis to discuss issues around the enterprise service.
Chairman, I accept what Tom's saying, and you're all intelligent people, and I don't think you're missing the point I'm trying to make. I hope, boring and laborious and repetitive as it has been, I hope I'm getting the message through to someone that if there was a board there that had the kind of enthusiasm that I've actually seen among you today, then perhaps the challenge in this report could be a lot easily met. And I'm saying no more, but I will be saying more.
We've heard you in that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Deputy Chairperson. And I have to say, we have to compliment the service where it does need to be complimented. And from my own personal, I think it's great now that I can get on a bus, a TransLink bus in Strabane or Derry, wherever, and travel to Dublin and come home on that same ticket in a Bus Éireann bus, which is good for people from my area, you know, so I have to say that that's excellent service now that's been provided. But just to conclude on the basis of the Audit Office report and what we've heard here today, I suppose it is clear to me and members of my committee that much more needs to be done by both the Department and TransLink to improve our public transport here. And I say that despite recent funding cuts, it is important that the appropriate proportion of funding is allocated to public transport, and that funding is utilised effectively and on the basis of effective regulatory and governance arrangements. And I've heard today that that's the way you're moving forward, and we'll be, I suppose, asking yourselves you did your opening speech about the recommendations coming out of the report, and it is good to hear that you are taking them forward. So members, we've all had the opportunity to ask our questions here today to our witnesses, and as there are no other final issues, I'd like to conclude by saying thank you to our witnesses for attending here today, and to wish you, David, all the best in your new career when you leave TransLink. And thank you for attending today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd also like to thank Ms Sewell and Kieran Donnelly, the Audit Office, for attending here today as well, and to thank Hansard for the coverage of this session.
Okay.
Yeah. Kieran, do you just want to do a wee mop-up? Yeah. Members, can I get agreement to go into closed session here?
Of course.
Yep.
Just for some members.